Operation Lam Son 719 was a limited-objective offensive campaign conducted in southeastern portion of the Kingdom of Laos by the armed forces of the Republic of Vietnam between the 8th of February and the 25th of March 1971. During the Vietnam War, the United States provided logistical, aerial, and artillery support to the operation, but its ground forces were prohibited by law from entering Laotian territory. The objective of the campaign was the disruption of a possible future offensive by the People's Army of Vietnam, whose logistical system within Laos was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By launching such a spoiling attack against PAVN's long-established logistical system, the American and South Vietnamese high commands hoped to resolve several pressing issues. A quick victory in Laos would bolster the morale and confidence of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which was already high in the wake of the successful Cambodian campaign of 1970. It would also serve as proof positive that South Vietnamese forces could defend the nation in the face of the continuing withdrawal of U.S. ground combat forces from the theater. The operation would be, therefore, a test of that policy and PAVN's capability to operate effectively by itself, because of the South Vietnamese need for security which precluded thorough planning, and inability by the political and military leaders of the U.S. and South Vietnam to face military realities and poor execution. Operation Lam Son 719 collapsed when faced by the determined resistance of a skillful foe. The campaign was a disaster for the PAVN, decimating some of its best units and destroying the confidence that had been built up over the previous 3 years. Background: between 1959 and 1970, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had become the key logistical artery for PAVN and the National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, in their effort to conduct military operations to topple the U.S.-supported government of South Vietnam and create a unified nation, running from the southwestern corner of North Vietnam through southeastern Laos and into the western portions of South Vietnam. The trail system had been the target of continuous U.S. aerial interdiction efforts that had begun in 1966. Only small-scale covert operations in support of the air campaigns had, however, been conducted on the ground inside Laos to halt the flow of men and supplies on the trail. Since 1966, over 630,000 men, 100,000 tons of foodstuffs, 400,000 weapons, and 50,000 tons of ammunition had traveled through the maze of gravel and dirt roads, paths, and river transportation systems that crisscrossed southeastern Laos and which linked up with a similar logistical system in neighboring Cambodia, known as the Sihanouk Trail. However, following the overthrow of Prince Norodom Sihanouk in 1970, the pro-American Lon Nol regime had denied the use of the port of Sihanoukville to communist shipping. Strategically, this was an enormous blow to the North Vietnamese effort, since 70% of all military supplies that supported its effort in the far south had moved through the port. A further blow to the logistical system in Cambodia had come in the spring and summer of 1970, when U.S. and PAVN forces had crossed the border and attacked PAVN NLF base areas during the Cambodian campaign. With the partial destruction of the North Vietnamese logistical system in Cambodia, the U.S. headquarters in Saigon determined that the time was propitious for a similar campaign in Laos. If such an operation were to be carried out, the U.S. command believed it would be best to do it quickly, while American military assets were still available in South Vietnam. Such an operation would create supply shortages that would be felt by PAVN NLF forces 12 to 18 months later, as the last U.S. troops were leaving South Vietnam, and thereby give the and its ally a respite from a possible communist offensive in the northern provinces for 1 year, possibly even 2. There were increasing signs of heavy communist logistical activity in southeastern Laos, activity which heralded just such a North Vietnamese offensive. Communist offensives usually took place near the conclusion of the Laotian dry season, and for PAVN logistical forces, the push to move supplies through the system came during the height of the season. One U.S. intelligence report estimated that 90% of PAVN material coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail was being funneled into the 3 northernmost provinces of South Vietnam, indicating forward stockpiling in preparation for offensive action. This build-up was alarming to both Washington and the American command, and prompted the perceived necessity for a spoiling attack to derail future communist objectives. Planning on the 8th of December 1970, in response to a request from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a highly secret meeting was held at the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam's Saigon headquarters, to discuss the possibility of an PAVN cross-border attack into southeastern Laos. According to General Creighton W. Abrams, the American commander in Vietnam, the main impetus for the offensive came from Colonel Alexander M. Haig, an aide to National Security Advisor Dr. Henry Kissinger. MACV had been disturbed by intelligence of a PAVN logistical build-up in southeastern Laos, but was reluctant to let the PAVN go it alone against the North Vietnamese. The group's findings were then sent on to the Joint Chiefs in Washington, D.C. By mid-December, President Richard M. Nixon had also become intrigued by possible offensive actions in Laos and had begun efforts to convince both General Abrams and the members of his cabinet of the efficacy of a cross-border attack. Abrams felt that undue pressure was being exerted on Nixon by Haig, but Haig later read that the military was lacking in enthusiasm for such an operation, and that, prodded remorselessly by Nixon and Kissinger, the Pentagon finally devised a plan for the Laotian operation. Other possible benefits which might accrue from such an operation were also being discussed. Admiral John S. McCain Jr. communicated with Admiral Thomas Mora, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that an offensive against the Ho Chi Minh Trail might compel Prince Suvarnabhumi, Prime Minister of Laos, to abandon the guise of neutrality and enter the war openly. On the 7th of January 1971, MACV was authorized to begin detailed planning for an attack against PAVN base areas 604 and 611. The task was given to the commander of U.S. 24th Corps, Lieutenant General James W. Sutherland, Jr., who had only 9 days to submit it to MACV for approval. The operation would consist of 4 phases. During the first phase, U.S. forces inside South Vietnam would seize the border approaches and conduct diversionary operations. Next would come an PAVN armored infantry attack along Route 9 toward the Laotian town of Chepone, the perceived nexus of Base Area 604. This advance would be protected by a series of leapfrogging aerial infantry assaults to cover the northern and southern flanks of the main column. During the third phase, search and destroy operations within Base Area 604 would be carried out, and finally, the South Vietnamese force would retire either back along Route 9 or through Base Area 611 and exit through the A Shau Valley. It was hoped that the force could remain in Laos until the rainy season was underway at the beginning of May, because of the notorious laxity of the South Vietnamese military when it came to security precautions and the uncanny ability of communist agents to uncover operational information. The planning phase lasted only a few weeks and was divided between the American and Vietnamese high commands. At the lower levels, it was limited to the intelligence and operational staffs of PAVN's 1st Corps, under Lieutenant General Hoang Shan Lam, who was to command the operation, and the 24th Corps, headed by General Sutherland. When Lam was finally briefed by MACV and the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff in Saigon, his chief of operations was forbidden to attend the meeting, even though he had helped to write the very plan under discussion. At this meeting, Lam's operational area was restricted to a corridor no wider than 15 miles on either side of Route 9 and a penetration no deeper than Chepone. Command, control, and coordination of the operation was going to be problematic, especially in the highly politicized South Vietnamese command structure, where the support of key political figures was of paramount importance in promotion to and retention of command positions. Lieutenant General Nguyen Cang, the Vietnamese Marine Corps commander and protégé of Vice President Nguyen Cao Kentucky, whose troops were scheduled to participate in the operation, actually outranked General Lam, who had the support of President Nguyen Van Thieu. The same situation applied to Lieutenant General Duc Uucta Cheng, commander of PAVN Airborne Forces, also scheduled to participate in the operation. After the incursion began, both men remained in Saigon and delegated the command authority to junior officers rather than take orders from Lam. This did not bode well for the success of the operation. Individual units did not learn about the planned participation until the 17th of January. The airborne division that was to lead the operation received no detailed plans until the 2nd of February, less than a week before the campaign was to begin. This was of crucial importance, since many of the units, particularly the airborne and the Marines, had worked as separate battalions and brigades and had no experience maneuvering or cooperating in adjoining areas. According to the assistant commander of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, planning was rushed, handicapped by security restrictions, and conducted separately and in isolation by the Vietnamese and the Americans. The U.S. portion of the operation was to bear the title Dewey Canyon II, named for Operation Dewey Canyon conducted by U.S. Marines in the northwestern South Vietnam in 1969. It was hoped that the reference to the previous operation would confuse Hanoi as to the actual target of the proposed incursion. The PAVN's portion was given the title Lam Son 719 after the village of Lam Son, birthplace of the legendary Vietnamese patriot Lai, who had defeated an invading Chinese army in 1427. The numerical designation came from the year 1971, and the main axis of the attack, Route 9. The decisions had been made at the highest levels and planning had been completed, but valuable time had been lost. The South Vietnamese were about to begin the largest, most complex, and most important operation of the war. The lack of time for adequate planning and preparation, as well as the absence of any real questioning about military realities and the capabilities of the PAVN were going to prove decisive. On the 29th of January, President Nixon gave his final approval for the operation. On the following day, Operation Dewey Canyon II was underway. Operations Dewey Canyon II. Any offensive planning by the U.S. was, however, limited by the passage on the 29th of December 1970 of the Cooper Church Amendment, which prohibited U.S. ground forces and advisors from entering Laos. Dewey Canyon II would, therefore, be conducted within territorial South Vietnam in order to reopen Route 9 all the way to the old Khe San combat base, which had been abandoned by U.S. forces in 1968. The base would be reopened and would then serve as the logistical hub and airhead of the PAVN incursion. U.S. combat engineers were tasked with clearing Route 9 and rehabilitating Khe San, while infantry and mechanized units secured a line of communications along the length of the road. American artillery units would support the PAVN effort within Laos from the South Vietnamese side of the border, while Army logisticians coordinated the entire supply effort for the South Vietnamese. Air support for the incursion would be provided by the aircraft of the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps, and U.S. Army aviation units were tasked with providing complete helicopter support for the PAVN operation. U.S. forces earmarked for these missions included 4 battalions of the 108th Artillery Group, 2 battalions of the 45th Engineer Group, the 101st Airborne Division, 6 battalions of the 101st Aviation Group, the 1st Brigade of the 5th Infantry Division, reinforced by 2 mechanized, 1 cavalry, 1 tank, and 1 airmobile infantry battalions, and 2 battalions of the 11th Infantry Brigade of the 23rd Infantry Division. On the morning of the 30th of January, armor engineer elements of the 1st Brigade, 5th Infantry Division headed west on Route 9, while the brigade's infantry elements were heli-lifted directly into the Khe San area. By the 5th of February, Route 9 had been secured up to the Laotian frontier. Simultaneously, the 101st Airborne Division began a feint into the A Shao Valley in order to draw PAVN attention away from Khe San. At the combat base, poor weather, obstacles, landmines, and unexploded ordnance pushed the rehabilitation of the airstrip a week behind schedule. As a response, a completely new airstrip had to be built and the first aircraft arrived on the 15th of February. PAVN resistance was almost non-existent and American casualties were light, with no previous Allied presence around Khe San. The North Vietnamese had seen no need to maintain large forces in the area. However, General Sutherland believed that the advance to Khe San had been a race between American and PAVN forces, and the U.S. had won. In order to preserve the security of the upcoming South Vietnamese operation, General Abrams had imposed a rare press embargo on the reporting of troop movements, but it was to no avail. Communist and non-American news agencies released reports of the build-up, and even before the lifting of the embargo on the 4th of February, speculation concerning the offensive was front-page news in the U.S. As had been the case during the Cambodian campaign, the government of Laos was not notified in advance of the intended operation. Prime Minister Souvanna Phauma would learn of the invasion of his supposedly neutral nation only after it was underway. Offensive by early 1971, North Vietnamese troop strength in the base area 604 area was estimated by U.S. intelligence at 22,000 men, 7,000 combat troops, 10,000 personnel in logistical and support units, and 5,000 Pathet Lao, all under the command of the newly created 70th Front. There were differing views on what the expected reaction of PAVN to the offensive might be. General Abrams believed that unlike Cambodia, the North Vietnamese would stand and fight for the Laotian base areas. As early as the 11th of December he had reported to Admiral McCain that strong infantry, armor and artillery formations were in southern Laos. Formidable air defenses were deployed. The mountainous, jungle-covered terrain was an added liability. Natural clearings for helicopter landing zones were scarce and likely to be heavily defended. The bulk of the enemy's combat units were in the vicinity of Chepone, and PAVN could be expected to defend his base areas and logistics centers against any Allied operation. A prescient CIA study released in December 1970 echoed Abrams' concerns and was supported by the 21st of January memorandum, which was remarkably accurate with respect to the nature, pattern, and all-out intensity of reactions. MACV intelligence, on the other hand, was convinced that the incursion would be only lightly opposed. Tactical airstrikes and artillery preparations would neutralize the estimated 170 to 200 anti-aircraft artillery weapons believed to be in the area, and the threat posed by PAVN armored units was considered minimal. North Vietnamese reinforcement capability was set at 14 days by 2 divisions north of the DMZ, and it was hoped that diversionary operations would occupy them for the duration of the operation. Unfortunately, when North Vietnamese reinforcements did arrive, they did not come from the north as expected, but from Base Area 611 and the A Shau Valley to the south, where 8 regiments, all supported by organic artillery units, were within 2 weeks' marching range. The North Vietnamese were expecting some sort of operation as early as the 26th of January, when the text of an intercepted radio message read, "It has been determined that the enemy may strike into our cargo carrier system in order to cut it off. Prepare to mobilize and strike the enemy hard. Be vigilant." The tactical airstrikes that were to precede the incursion and suppress known anti-aircraft positions were suspended 2 days prior to the operation due to poor flying weather. After a massive preliminary artillery bombardment and 11 B-52 Stratofortress missions, the incursion began on the 8th of February, when a 4,000-man ARVN Armor Infantry Task Force consisting of the 3rd Armored Brigade and the 1st and 8th Airborne Battalions advanced west unopposed along Route 9. To cover the northern flank, ARVN airborne and Ranger elements were deployed to the north of the main advance. The South Vietnamese 39th Ranger Battalion was heli-lifted into a landing zone known as Ranger North, while the 21st Ranger Battalion moved into Ranger South. These outposts were to serve as tripwires for any communist advance into the zone of the ARVN incursion. Meanwhile, the 2nd Airborne Battalion occupied Fire Support Base 30, while the 3rd Airborne Brigade headquarters and the 3rd Airborne Battalion went into FSB 31. Troops of the 1st Infantry Division simultaneously combat assaulted into LZ's Blue, Dawn, White, and Brown and FSB's Hotel, Delta and Delta 1, covering the southern flank of the main advance. The mission of the ARVN Central Column was to advance down the valley of the Chepone River, a relatively flat area of brush interspersed with patches of jungle and dominated by heights to its north and the river and more mountains to the south. Almost immediately, supporting helicopters began to take fire from the heights, which allowed PAVN gunners to fire down on the aircraft from pre-registered machine gun and mortar positions. Making matters worse for the advance, Route 9 was in poor condition, so poor in fact that only tracked vehicles and jeeps could make the westward journey. This threw the burden of reinforcement and resupply onto the aviation assets. The helicopter units then became the essential mode of logistical support, a role that was made increasingly more dangerous due to low cloud cover and incessant anti-aircraft fire. The Armored Task Force secured Route 9 all the way to Ban Dong, 20 kilometers inside Laos and approximately halfway to Chepone. By the 11th of February, Laos had become the central fire base and command center for the operation. The plan then called for a quick ground thrust to secure the main objective, but South Vietnamese forces had stalled at Dewey while awaiting orders to proceed from General Lam. 2 days later, Generals Abrams and Sutherland flew to Lam's forward command post at Thong Ha in order to speed up the timetable. At the meeting of the generals, it was instead decided to extend the 1st Division's line of outposts south of Route 9 westward to cover the projected advance. This would take an additional 5 days. Back in Washington, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird and the Joint Chiefs tried to refute claims by reporters that the South Vietnamese advance had stalled. At a press conference, Laird claimed that the halt at Dewey was simply a pause that was giving PAVN commanders a chance to watch and assess enemy movements. The operation is going according to plan.